10 days ago, as Israeli families celebrated the Sabbath and a Jewish holiday, Iran's terrorist proxy Hamas launched a barbaric surprise attack against Israel, killing at least 1,400 Israelis and 30 Americans. Hamas fired thousands of rockets at Israeli cities and then infiltrated communities to massacre mothers, fathers, children, and grandparents. It was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since American GIs liberated the final concentration camps of the Third Reich. Hamas terrorists raped women, paraded corpses through the streets, and posted their crimes on social media. They burned families alive, and they murdered babies. In this time of horror and grief, my prayers are with the people of Israel, and I know I'm not alone. Upon hearing the dark news last Saturday, God-fearing Americans across the country knelt in prayer for the people of Israel. I believe all Israel was uplifted by the prayers of our people for theirs that day. But like Israelis, Americans don't remain on bended knee for long. And let me remind you again that Hamas also massacred 30 Americans and may hold as many as 13 hostage, making it one of the worst terror attacks against America in recent times. We have to avenge those deaths and do everything possible to bring those missing Americans home. We stand squarely with Israel and its objective to destroy Hamas, not only as a terror group, but as a governing entity and a social movement. But Hamas did not act alone, and it shouldn't pay the price alone. Hamas wouldn't exist at the scale and savagery that it does without Iran. Iran funds Hamas's political organization in Gaza. Iran assisted Hamas in manufacturing the rockets and drones it used on the October 7th attacks. And Iran trained many of the Hamas terrorists who organized and executed these attacks. Most damning, according to the Wall Street Journal, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps helped plot the attack against Israel. And Iran's foreign minister even attended meetings with Hamas and the IRGC to discuss the attacks. Yet President Biden could soon hand the terror regime in Tehran another $6 billion in cash. Joe Biden has already given the Ayatollahs $90 billion through his lax enforcement of oil sanctions and his unfreezing of Iranian assets. Tehran has predictably used this Biden bonus to strengthen its military and arm its proxies. Just last year, Iran doubled the budget of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the shock troops of its terror regime, and it more than tripled its support for Hamas's military brigades. Worse, since President Biden took office, Iran and its proxies have attacked American troops more than 83 times. It has armed Russia in its war in Ukraine, and it has helped orchestrate the worst terrorist attack since September 11. The last thing we should do is give Iran another $6 billion in a dangerous ransom payment for American hostages. Under public and congressional pressure, the Biden administration purported to delay the release of this $6 billion in concert with Qatar, where the money is now located. But color me skeptical of a quiet understanding between a soft on Iran Joe Biden and a soft on Hamas government of Qatar, especially since the administration refuses to freeze the funds and reserves the right to release the $6 billion at any time without notifying Congress or the public. And even more especially since the Qatari Prime Minister and Foreign Minister stood on a stage last week with the Secretary of State and said in Arabic that there were no changes to the agreement under which Iran could access the $6 billion. That's why Senator McConnell and I have introduced a simple bill to prevent President Biden from making this $6 billion payment to Iran. it rescinds the sanctions waiver issued by Joe Biden and Tony Blinken, locking down those funds and preventing the Iranian regime from withdrawing them. Like Barack Obama before him, President Biden simply can't be trusted when it comes to Iran. Appeasement and accommodation are instinctual for them. Whether it takes days, weeks, or months, Joe Biden will revert to form. In fact, he already seems to be doing so. This legislation would stop such a predictable reversal. I'm pleased to report that many of my Democratic colleagues have joined Senator McConnell and me to call for the freezing of this $6 billion. Understandably so, since it means Iran will have an extra $6 billion to support Hamas, to expand the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and to accelerate its nuclear program. So, will they allow this bill to pass today, or are they all talk on the campaign trail and no action here in the Senate? Let's find out. Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S. 3041 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Senator from Vermont.
Reserving the right to object. Make a few comments. First of all, the senator from Arkansas speaks for 100 members of the Senate when he expresses his outrage at the horrendous killings, terrorist acts by Hamas against innocent people in Israel. The worst attack and suffering in Israel since the Holocaust. So the senator from Arkansas speaks for every single one of us. Second, and his characterization of Iran as a malign actor, their association with Hamas, Hezbollah, the attacks they had on our soldiers when they were in Iraq, I believe the senator from Arkansas speaks for all 100 of us. He certainly speaks for me. And I want to salute the senator for the time that he has spent during his service in the Senate, alerting America to the threat that Iran faces. But I object for the following reasons. First of all, this president, President Biden, made a tough decision that presidents before him had to make, including President Trump, about using the power of the office to bring back hostages who were viciously detained, cruelly detained, in this case by Iran. He made that decision, and with the help of Qatar, we were able to bring 5 American hostages home. That is a tough decision. But I would disagree with my colleague when he says that decision in any way indicates weakness or lack of resolve on behalf of President Biden towards what is happening and has happened to Israel. There is no better friend to Israel than President Joe Biden. He has been an ally, supporter of Israel throughout his time of service in the United States Senate, as Vice President, and as President of the United States. And I do disagree, but this is not the time to get into the debate about the senator from Arkansas's characterization of some of the intelligence about what was the role of Iran in what just happened. It's a debate for a separate time. I also want to disagree with the characterization that this is more money that is going to go to Iran. When this was being negotiated, there was great care given to the fact that this money had to be fenced off so that it could only be used essentially for humanitarian purposes. And I'm talking about medicine, medical devices, food, and agricultural products. And let's keep in mind that, yes, we have an adversary in Iran with the Ayatollahs, with the Iran Revolutionary Guard. But there are Iranians who are suffering and who do need medicine. And our beef is not with the people, it's with that government. How are these funds limited? No bank can approve any one of the transactions. This money is not in the hands of Iran. And for any money to be released, we have the backup of Qatar, where the funds are deposited. And the money cannot be approved for any expenditure to any vendor unless it gets approval from the United States government first. So there is constant monitoring to make certain that the purpose, that it be for humanitarian use only, is met. So the U.S. completely controls the valve in these funds with the backup of Qatar. Finally, this would be somewhat insulting to the confidence we've placed in Qatar and what diplomatic efforts they may be involved in now for other hostages, I don't know. But we want to express confidence in Qatar that has assisted us to bring five Americans home. And then finally, there's the basic proposition. The United States made an agreement here. We got the benefit of that agreement with 5 Americans back home with their families. Mr. President, we keep our word. We keep our word. So for these reasons, I object to the unanimous consent request.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Arkansas.
I just want to respond briefly to my friend from Vermont. And he's my friend from Vermont. I don't mean that in the way that senators usually say that when they say friends from another state, that they're not actually friends and they oftentimes can't stand each other. He is my friend from Vermont, and he has been so since we served together in the House some time ago. First, I will note, as I said, that 9 Democratic senators have joined my call to freeze this money. Those would be Senator Rosen, Senator Manchin, Senator Baldwin, Senator Casey, Senator Sinema, Senator Cortez Masto, Senator Brown, Senator Kelly, and Senator Tester. I will observe from that list, 7 of those 9 are up for re-election in difficult campaigns next year. Unlike my friend from Vermont, who just won his election in one of the most Democratic states in the country. So I wonder why these 7 Democratic senators who are at risk on the campaign trail last year weren't willing to join my bill. We offered them all the opportunity to join the bill, but it was radio silence. Could it be that they want to say one thing on the campaign trail and do another thing here in the Senate? A few points that the senator from Vermont made, that this was a tough decision to free hostages and that we have to keep our word. It's always tough decisions when we face hostage situations overseas. However, paying $6 billion for 5 American hostages, $1.2 billion for hostages, simply encourages more hostage taking. We saw this the last time we paid ransom to Iran under the Obama administration. They immediately took more of the hostages that we just freed by paying ransom. I also have to note that just a few weeks after we paid that ransom, Hamas perpetrated this attack and took over 200 hostages. Maybe they took a lesson from what President Biden did with the hostages held by Iran. And really, we can't be so naive as to think that, well, we've made this deal and we got the hostages back, so we have to give Iran the benefit of the bargain, as if you can deal in good faith with a terror regime like Iran. Second, Senator from Vermont said there's been no better friend than President Biden to Israel over his long, long career in public office. I have to say, I find it hard to believe that Israel can have no better friend than a man who has spent decades, to include 11 years as vice president and president, empowering Iran, the worst enemy of Israel, a regime that still chants death to America and death to Israel, by giving them hundreds of billions of dollars of sanction relief, by putting them on the path to get a nuclear weapon, by, for instance, not insisting that we continue the multilateral sanctions on Iran's missile program that expire under the nuclear deal tomorrow. That's right, tomorrow, October 18th, the 8-year anniversary of the part of the nuclear deal with Iran that says multilateral sanctions on their missile and drones will expire at a time when Iran is providing missiles and drones to Russia to kill Ukrainians. Joe Biden also, when he came to office, didn't just empower Iran, he was empower the exact terror proxies we're talking about. U.S. law prohibits the payment of aid to Palestinians that engage in so-called martyr payments, the grotesque practice of paying the families of suicide bombers and murderers of Jews, or paying them if they survive. Congress stopped that practice, something called the Taylor Force Law. The administration has refused to enforce that law. To my knowledge, they continue to say that they'll make aid payments to Palestinian entities, which in the end, inevitably, free up more resources to attack Israel. Which gets to another point the senator from Vermont made, that this $6 billion is sitting in Qatar and is kind of escrow account and is only going to be used for humanitarian purposes or things like food and medicine and so forth. I understand that's the argument. I get that. But of course, money is fungible. Iran now has $6 billion free to do other things. If a family in Arkansas is struggling to pay the bill for the groceries, and they don't know if they can buy Christmas presents for their kids, and they win a $500 gift card to a grocery store at a Friday night football booster club event, guess what? It may not pay for the Christmas gifts, but they now have $500 freed up to buy Christmas gifts. The exact same principle applies here. And no, the Iranian people or the Iranian government doesn't care for its people. That's why they oppress them and murder them. I grant you that. But they also need some kind of social stability to maintain their grip on power. So yes, it is a direct benefit to the terror regime in Tehran that they get $6 billion for things like food and medicine that frees up their finances for other activities, like supporting Hamas and supporting Hezbollah and supporting the proxies in Syria and Iraq that have attacked Americans more than 83 times. And the senator from Vermont also mentioned the suffering Iranians. They are indeed suffering. They have for more than 40 years under the yoke of the Ayatollahs. They have occasionally risen up in opposition. In 2009, during the Green Revolution, when Barack Obama stood idly by and did nothing to support these brave Iranians, with Joe Biden sitting by his side. Where was he? Was he caught flat-footed? Was he naive? Was he an inexperienced president in his 5th month in office? No. He didn't support the Iranian people when they were rising up against the Ayatollahs in the summer of 2019 because he prioritized above all else atoning for America's sins against Iran in his mind and procuring a nuclear deal that would elevate Iran to a regional power that would balance off against our friends in Israel and the Arab nations so we could exit the region. And that's the exact policy that Joe Biden has pursued in his nearly 3 years in office as well. There's been uprisings in Iran for over a year. Where's the administration been to support them? And I would just say finally, the point about the intelligence on whether Iran had foreknowledge of these attacks, was involved at all in planning them. I think there are disputes about that. I find it very skeptical that an organization that gets more than 90% of its funding from Tehran would launch an attack like this against Israel without Iran at least tacitly blessing it, but also say to the point of analogy. You cannot breed pit bulls, feed them, house them, train them to attack and kill, and then let them off the leash and claim no responsibility when they maul your neighbors. That's exactly what Iran has done with terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and militias in Syria and Iraq. So I regret that my friend from Vermont drew the short straw to come down here and object on behalf of his vulnerable Democratic colleagues. I'll continue to work with my colleagues and hopefully some of those Democrats who claim they want to stop this $6 billion from being released, because the last thing we should be doing after these atrocious attacks on Israel and on America, I remind you, is enriching the Ayatollahs any further. Mr. President, I yield the floor.